Thank you so much for joining us this evening. As was already said, the culture wars an American import, and I'm so excited to be joined by this fantastic panel to talk about this fascinating and important subject. We have Tomiwa Owolade, who is a writer and author of a book that addresses this very subject, This Is Not America, Why Black Lives in Britain Matter. We also have Sonia Sodha, who is an Observer chief leader writer and also columnist. And we also have James Bloodworth, who is a broadcaster, documentary producer and writer. And he has authored books around meritocracy and work in this country. So got lots of different angles here, and we'll get right into it. So I think first and foremost, we'll go to you, Tomiwa. What's your initial response to that question? Is the culture wars an American import?
Some aspects of the culture wars are definitely an American import. What is most clear to me from my perspective and my reading of the topic is that when we talk about issues such as race in the UK, we internalize an American way of thinking about that particular issue to such an extent that we can't analyze race matters with the necessary nuance that such a complex matter deserves. And one of the problems with the culture wars, in fact, the way the culture wars are often framed, is this moral simplicity with which many people approach the topic. And I think one of the other problems of the culture wars is this tendency that I see from many self-professed progressive and liberal people in which they complain about stoking culture wars, whilst at the same time expressing beliefs and opinions which are counterintuitive to most of the general public. You see this tendency, for example, in the way in which history is talked about in the UK, viewing issues such as imperialism as this simplistic moral issue without any degree of nuance, sophistication, any attention to the fact that this is a complex issue. And with regards to my book, the reason why I wrote my book in the first place is I felt that debates around race and issues related to race needed a greater dose of nuance and specificity. And if we simply internalize an American way of thinking and looking at race, we would be unable to do that.
So lots of interesting points there that I'll come back to in the chair discussion. Yourself, Sonia?
Great, thank you. So I guess when I think culture wars, the issue that I go to first, because I've written about it a lot, I've written about race too, but I've written a lot about the issue of gender and gender ideology. And I wanted to sort of focus my comments on that, partly because I knew Tomiwa was going to come along and speak far more eloquently than I can about race, but also because personally, and it'd be interesting to get into this, I think, in the discussion, I think while there are certainly aspects of the US discourse on race that we've imported, I think it's been far worse with gender ideology, actually. And I think there are aspects of it that we just imported wholesale, and we're now sort of having a reckoning moment with that in UK culture. And we can talk about why I think those differences exist. I think there are important reasons for differences between race and gender. That isn't to detract from anything that you said at all. I think it's important to be clear about what I mean when I say gender ideology. So for me, it's very distinct from robust protection against discrimination for trans people, which I think is incredibly important. Most left-wing feminists that I know is incredibly important. The UK was one of the first countries in the world to introduce it in law. That's really important, and hopefully we can all be on the same page on that. Gender ideology is something distinct, which it is the belief, it's a controversial and minority belief that gender identity can replace sex altogether, self-declared gender identity in society, or is more important than it. And those, for me, are two very different things. And I guess I've been writing about this issue for about 3 years. If you ascribe to that controversial minority belief, it throws up a number of issues and very contested debates in society. One is around same-sex attraction, and that's why it's an issue that divides the gay and lesbian community very strongly, because some gay and lesbian people, including some of my gay and lesbian friends, think that if sex isn't important, what does same-sex attraction even mean? And it kind of undermines the whole concept of being gay or lesbian. It takes you into contested territory around children and gender dysphoria, and we've had a huge debate about that, which it feels like we are moving towards a more evidence-based approach in this country, but not before time and not before I think a lot of harm has been done to children through unevidence-based approaches that put them on a medical pathway. And it also takes you into contested debates about single-sex spaces. Now, you know, I'm a small L liberal. I think most circumstances in society, it doesn't matter what sex you are, it doesn't matter what gender you are, but I'm also a feminist who understands male violence. And single-sex spaces are incredibly important, some of them for women, in terms of safety, dignity and privacy. And if you can't agree as a society about what a woman is, and for me a woman is somebody who is of the female sex, that takes you into very contested territory as well. And I think for me, in terms of, so I think we have imported the US dialogue on this, but I think what's really interesting is over the last 2 or 3 years, there has been a fight back, an increasingly vocal fight back, and it has come actually primarily from left-wing gender-critical feminists, which is very, very different to the US. So although this ideology, it's a minority ideology, polling shows that. People don't literally believe that people can change sex. People don't literally think that trans women are women. But it has taken a really significant hold across many of our institutions in society, from the NHS to you know, the police. You've had big institutions that have been found by the courts to behave unlawfully because they take a wrong view of sex and gender, which is quite an extraordinary situation to get yourself in, really, that this is a minority belief. Most people don't believe it in society, and yet a small but very, very vocal minority has managed to get some big institutions to take the belief that that sex doesn't matter anymore and it's all about self-declared gender identity, and to sort of enshrine that belief in the way they act to people in ways that mean that they have actually behaved unlawfully towards women who value single-sex spaces. So I think that's pretty incredible. But there has been this fight back. It's mostly come, it's a big difference between the US and the UK. I think in the UK, we have a tradition of grassroots working class feminism that's based in the trade union movement. And that is, I think, a big reason why some women in this country said, no, we're not just getting with this idea that sex doesn't matter when you're talking about spaces where women are undressing, for example. So I think that's a big difference with the US, and why left-wingers in the US call us Turf Island. I actually think that's a form of left-wing US cultural imperialism, which obviously is quite deeply ironic given how much they say that they hate imperialism. But they cannot understand why left-wing feminists in the UK, some left-wing feminists, oppose gender ideology as they see a great progressive cause. I think just one thing I really want to say is, so I do think of myself as a small L liberal. I'm a journalist. I find the idea that sex doesn't matter really problematic in those 3 domains that I spoke about, and I can say more about it in the discussion. But I would like to think that, I'm a liberal, I'm a journalist, that, well, we just argue it out and the best ideas win. The real lesson for me in writing about this issue for the last 3 years is actually that isn't enough. And if you really care about free speech, it's not enough just to use your free speech. You have to think about organisational cultures. And I think what has really astounded me is the dynamic by which a very vocal small minority have essentially bullied proper grown-ups who are running massive organisations, the BBC, NHS England, the NHS Confederation, the police, into basically just taking something as read that shouldn't be read because it's a very live societal debate. And you have to understand institutional cultures to understand how that works. And that is why you've essentially had the police acting unlawfully towards people with gender critical belief. We haven't seen a case yet, but I think that the NHS England's policy on single-sex wards, if somebody took it to court, would probably be found to be unlawful, an actual a sort of on-the-ground case. And it's just extraordinary the way this has happened, and you've got to understand institutional cultures. And I think for me, a real light bulb moment, I've written about this issue in relation to schools, was talking to a parent about how her child was treated when their child said essentially, well, we think we're of the other sex. And the parents wanted to take a watchful waiting approach, which is what is supported by the evidence. It's where the independent cast review is ending up. And yet there was it wasn't even the head teacher in the school. The head teacher listened to the parents and said, yeah, I get you. We're not going to do this. You've got clinical input that suggests that a different approach would be better. We're not going to use different pronouns. We're not going to call your child by a different name. And yet there was a small number of teachers in the school who basically bullied everyone else into the school and doing it and just ignored the head teacher. Yeah. And that is an example of how, whether it's at the macro level or at the very, very grassroots level, a powerful ideology can take hold through that only a small number of people believe in, but that other people get bullied into just going along with because they're too scared to speak out against it. And I don't think liberals can really challenge that. And I think we're seeing the tide turn in the UK. We're seeing it turn through the courts. Women are winning cases left, right and centre. Hugely expensive, painful, time-consuming cases to win. So we're seeing the tide turning, but that has led to a change in debate, I think, at the political level. But it's very hard, once these cultures set in, it's very, very difficult to basically say, well, this isn't the law, you shouldn't be acting like this, because there are people in these institutions who believe very strongly it is the law. Actually, sex doesn't matter. You've got to let people use the changing facilities that they want to in schools, for example. So I think there's a real lesson for liberals in terms of understanding this rapid organisational culture change and understanding how to counter it, I think is really important.
Yeah, I think we'll come back to a lot of those points that you made. I think are really important. How a minority idea gets taken up by institutions so quickly. Over to you, James.
Yeah, I mean, do I think that the culture was an American import? I mean, I think most things are an American import in some way. I think it's, yeah, I mean, yes and no. I mean, I think Tom covers this very well in his book, what aspects of the Black Lives Matter movement are appropriate to import to the UK and which aren't. I think as someone who takes an interest really in class politics, I think the kind of transposition of American categories of identity onto the British context can be very unhelpful at times. So I tend to think that social class, I mean, again, not to downplay sex discrimination or racial discrimination, but I tend to think social class in the UK, if you look at the data, tends to be the thing that holds people back the most. And I think that when you import like American identity politics, this kind of hair-splitting kind of obsession with identity, when you bring that into the UK, sometimes you can get class disadvantage can be very overlooked. So that's something that like creeps into the area I've been interested in for a few years now. I also think that it's just a mistake but also I think it's a mistake to say that the culture war is entirely an American import, because there are a lot of like new left thinkers. Herbert Marcuse was a good example, who German American, very influential on the European new left, and those ideas are, in my view, one of the problematic aspects of the American discourse at the moment. So it's gone to America, then come back here again. So Herbert Marcuse, his idea of repressive tolerance is something you see scholars like Ibrahim X. Kendi kind of using that idea, the idea that if that free speech, if someone says something prejudiced, that's not really free speech. And Herbert Marcuse's idea was that repressive tolerance, that you should be intolerant of right-wing ideas essentially, and you should kind of repress those. So I think it's a bit of a mistake to see that all of this stuff is just something that's coming over for America. There's a lot of new left ideas that were quite authoritarian, which have been kind of repackaged in the quote-unquote woke form. But I also think the right is also playing the culture war. So, you have like everything at the moment on sections of the right is kind of funneled through this kind of culture war prism. So everything is bashed through kind of a culture war shaped hole. I think this kind of anti-elitist politics, which is kind of has nothing to say about kind of economic privileges. It's all about kind of trying to stoke this culture war and talk about kind of the tofu eating woke elites and all this kind of nonsense. I think the right in the UK, I mean, you have people in the UK trying to set up a Fox News at the moment. You have people who trying to set up a UK equivalent of Fox News. They very clearly looked at the American right, the Tea Party movements in the 90s and the 2000s, the kind of paranoid right in the US, and thought, let's import that to the UK. It's not just a case of the left waging culture war. A good example of this is you have Tory MPs who own kind of huge buy-to-let portfolios, who you'll read in the newspaper raging against kind of champagne socialists. I mean, how many cases of champagne can you buy with 10 buy-to-let properties? I mean, quite a few, right? So it's kind of this fatuous, there's this kind of fatuous argument that I think people on the right are making at the moment. And it's very easy, I think, it's very easy for this kind of populist movement to kind of everything to head in this direction of kind of a right-wing apologia, which is, I do think there's, like, Yasha Mank's book, I think, on the identity synthesis was very good. I think there is a very good liberal and social democratic argument to make against some of the kind of extremist elements of the woke movement that doesn't kind of slide down into this very right-wing populist apologia, which has just as much wants to play this culture war game, but from a very self-interested perspective.
Lots of interesting points to come back to. I think I'll start with you, Tomiwa, and I've got two questions, and so I'll ask the first one. Firstly, a response to what James said, 'cause I thought that was very interesting, and I've been thinking about that as well. This idea that actually the culture wars are very much a kind of European intellectual development. I mean, Cynical Theories, Helen Pluckrose and James Lindsay's book, very much places the origins in continental European intellectuals, the whole idea of the kind of postmodernists and so on. So doesn't that to some extent reveal the way in which ideas just travel? Can we really put things in such a narrow box and say this is an American import, when actually they probably imported the postmodernists, repackaged it for their own ends, and we've kind of adopted it?
Yes, that's true. And ideas across the Atlantic always go back and forth to such an extent that it becomes difficult to trace the fundamental origins of these ideas. And what James said about the culture wars not simply being about the UK importing woke arguments, I think is correct. Because I would say some of the most influential Black American thinkers and my views on race illustrate the extent to which it would be disingenuous on my part to say I am anti-American, because there are so many profoundly interesting Black American thinkers on racial matters that have inspired my thinking on the subject. So I think when we talk about importing the culture wars from America, or importing any ideas from America, I don't see it as necessarily a bad thing. Of course, as I argue in my book and in many of my writings, there are many aspects of it which I see as negative, but there are other aspects of it which I see as interesting and positive. And at a more sort of general level, I am a big fan of popular American culture. I love American films, American TV shows, American music, American fiction, many aspects of American culture. So I think when we talk about importing culture wars, we need to be more specific in our focus rather than making any sort of generalization.
And just on a similar point, I think what's quite interesting to me, why we adopt the American culture wars from a racial perspective, isn't it partly because the American racial story just is so fundamentally powerful? I mean, when you look at slavery, not colonial slavery, and then the Jim Crow era and segregation, and the way in which the civil rights movement was this powerful expression of human agency that transform the world, really. That is the kind of moral story that we take inspiration from. So when we talk about I guess importing American culture was in a way is almost so difficult not to, because their story is so powerful.
It is a great story, and Black American people are the most powerful and influential Black people in the world. And the reason why that's the case is not because they're Black, it's because they're Americans. That is why, and I think that American aspect of it is so important. Social media is another big reason why we internalize American ways of thinking and looking at the world. Anyone that navigates through Twitter or X and Instagram and any other social media site, especially if they speak English, will inevitably navigate through American culture. And when I was a young kid, I definitely internalized the American way of looking at race. There was this TV show which first came out in the 70s called Roots. And when I was a kid, that show was still powerful and influential. And I remember watching it and feeling a sense of kinship with the transatlantic experience of slavery, even though that particular experience doesn't translate to my own West African background. So I think we internalize American ways of looking at race, but I think the racial aspect of it is just symptomatic of a wider cultural phenomenon, which is that when we think about culture and politics and technology more generally, we look to America. And one obvious example now is the obsession amongst almost everyone with the American presidential election.
No, I think that's a very, very good point. And James, you mentioned that class gets obscured when we import the American culture wars, but in a way, isn't part of that also just to do with the fact that class has a very different meaning to what it did maybe 20, 30 years ago? The unions don't have as much power. The kind of relationship people have to work is different. We no longer have industries necessarily that center around particular communities and so on. So I guess my question is you mentioned the left, is it kind of grappling for new groups essentially to give meaning to it? Because in a way, class no longer has that same radicalizing force within the left that it once used to.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's partly because there's kind of we identify more as the way we consume rather than the way we produce, for example. So you have I know the 20th century left, you have the 20th century working class. There was this onus around identifying with how you produce, with identifying with your kind of institutional affiliation, whether it's a trade union, whether it's like a social club, whether it's a religious affiliation, whether it's the church or something. And a lot of those things are kind of those collective forms of identification have kind of faded away. And we identify more today. You know, there's more flexibility in terms of what you identify with, but it tends to be more consumption related. I think the identity narrative fits in with that a bit more than the class narrative. I think it's I mean, in the UK, yes, you have people didn't really have faith in the working class anymore, so they started to look for these other liberation movements. That's the kind of the classic story of it, and there is truth to that. It's like the working class shrunk, more people moved up into the middle class. There isn't that kind of, you can't just rely on this big group of working class people to automatically align with the left anymore. So they had to look for these other kind of people to liberate in some ways. Yeah, I mean that's kind of part of it. Why some of the American categories can be imported easily to the UK, I think. Yeah, for sure.
And Sonia, I think you outlined very eloquently just the way in which, as I said before, that minority ideas become adopted. Why do you think that is? I mean, I think that I think the gender example is such a good example of the way in which kind of feminists have had to organise and push back and really comb through legislation, and having to see how so much of this stuff was seemingly implemented totally anti-democratically without people's awareness. And a similar thing often happens with the race stuff. How do you think that happened, and why do you think that is?
Yeah, I'm still astounded at how quickly a minority idea just took root across a large number of institutions. I actually sometimes, when I think about it, I just can't believe it. And I think actually it's really good that you mentioned social media, Tomiwa, because I think, you know, putting it in the context of sort of what's happening more broadly, yes, some of this stuff came from the US, but I think there is a universal human desire for witch hunts and getting off on witch hunts, actually, that's quite unhealthy, that I think social media really, I think social media actually, I mean, not to sound too, you know, there are obviously good sides to social media, don't get me wrong, but I do think that the way that social media works and the way these platforms interact with our human psychology brings out some of the worst sides and tendencies in us as human beings. And I think that's particularly true when it comes to kind of witch hunts and bullying and going after people for thinking the wrong thing. And I think social media has been a big part of the story. So I think what, for me, like how I would characterize the dynamic, I suppose, is this kind of minority idea getting lots of traction on social media, and, you know, people literally saying stuff like no debate, there's no debate, and sorry, if you don't believe that gender identity can replace sex, you're just transphobic, you're an evil bigot. You don't think that male people should be in women's prisons, you're a bigot, you know, and that getting a lot of traction. And then the institutions that you would expect to counter, because I think actually social media, we just have to live with it. It's there, and we're not actually going to be able to do very much to regulate it. It's just part of, you know, being human now. But you would really look to institutions normally to mediate the impacts of social media. And actually, institutions are some of the worst players in this. I mean, like, look at Stonewall. They were using social media, you know, as a tool. And so you're always going to get individuals on social media who take really extreme views, but actually institutions just went along with these views and started bullying other institutions. So I think you really have to kind of understand the way that social media interacts with real institutions in which real people are learning and working and, you know, getting treated or receiving services. And there is just something, I think, so powerful and actually quite scary about how those two have interacted on the gender issue. That means that actually it's really fed that universal human desire for witch hunts. And, you know, there have been loads of cases, like when you look back in history, of where this has happened. And I think actually we sort of reflected a bit on it at the Equiano conference on race in Cambridge. And, you know, we had lots of Americans there, and I was talking to people and we were reflecting on it on a panel. And, you know, there's a bit of me that thinks that actually the sort of, you know, 200, 300 years of enlightenment or you know, small L liberalism, where you had a relatively free exchange of ideas, you know, that maybe that's just actually that's not what our human nature is, and we're reverting to type almost. And I do think that you cannot take the free exchange of ideas in smaller liberalism for granted, and I think liberals probably have for quite a long time. And I just think that the extent to which, you know, I come back to it, I'm still like quite shocked at how something just took root so quickly, like to the extent that some kids are being taught this in schools as fact. And I just think it should be such a salutary reminder to the power of ideology and human psychology and witch hunts. And, you know, you have to work so hard to have tolerance of ideas, not just different identities. And I think we probably forgot that for a while.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think with, say, cancel culture, I think you have to look at also the economic incentives around it. So we live in a society in the West at the moment where the kind of bottom's fallen out of journalism, the bottom's fallen out of these kind of creative professions in terms of actually earning money. And one of the quickest ways to make a name for yourself, well, there are two very quick ways to make a name for yourself. One is to claim a scalp from someone, like you get someone fired, you get I don't know, someone from the newspaper, some cultural figure fired for their kind of their politically incorrect views. That's one way to do it. Or it's to claim vexatiously that you've been cancelled, and then you'll be on the newspaper front page the next day. Then you'll be all over YouTube. There's like those two things aren't those two things are compatible. You can have, like, you have two things going on. You have one set of people vexatiously claiming to have been cancelled when they haven't. Then you have people actually being losing their jobs or suffering professional repercussions because of something they've said online. And part of it is the same kind of dynamic where you have this kind of elite, what was called elite overproduction. You have people coming out of universities with these degrees, and the industries are no longer viable anymore. So one of the ways to make a name for yourself, where the economic incentives lie, one of the ways to kind of generate clout is to do one of those two things. So I think the economic landscape is one of the kind of factors behind this culture.
Yeah, I think that's totally right. And one of the reasons why I actually hate the term cancel culture is I think it's quite unedifying in a way, and it really treats it really diminishes something that is real. So cancel culture obscures the fact that on gender, a whole crop of women, many of whom we don't even know about, have been bullied, discriminated against, harassed in the workplace. It is unbelievable how many employment tribunal wins we are seeing from gender critical women who've been and to call it cancel culture just like makes it sound like it's nothing at all. These are people who've been discriminated against in the workplace and bullied, and their lives have been made hell. Look at Kathleen Stock, what happened to her. It diminishes it to call it to dismiss it as cancel culture.
Just on the point of the American influence, there's a question I wanted to ask you, Tomiwa. I mean, and I think you touched upon this rightly in your book. I mean, because is there a danger in us letting British elites off the hook? Because part of it, to some extent, is that they've imported wholesale the American cultures, because there's been almost kind of lack of curiosity of the specificities of the UK context. So that's the history of, now we talk about Windrush a lot, but that's almost become this kind of like catch-all term for everything. But actually, there is the kind of different waves of migration, the struggles that people faced, and so on. And it's much easier to go, well, America, rather than actually look at what's going on here.
And I think that's partly understandable for a very obvious demographic reason, which is that from the time America became a country up until now, the share of the American population that's black has been between about 12-13% to about 20%, whereas the share of the population of the UK that's black is now 4%, and that's the highest it's ever been. And the overwhelming majority, actually the majority of black people in the UK as of today are either immigrants or the children of immigrants from Africa that have arrived in the UK over the past 25, 30 years. So I think that there's a very obvious reason why the Black American story is more is seen as a template to understand the Black British story, which is because the legacy of Black America is much longer and much deeper than the Black British legacy. And I think one of the interesting things is that what makes somebody Black British is not something that's settled yet. Because another interesting dynamic to this is the increase in the mixed race population, the fastest rising ethnic minority group in the UK. And it'll be interesting to see in the future the ways in which people amongst that population group identify themselves as well.
James, is there a kind of inevitability, or for example, just talking about the history? I mean, America was a former British colony. Like, our histories are so deeply intertwined. I mean, if you look at Blair and Bush and kind of Thatcher and Reagan, and to a different way, Donald Trump and Boris Johnson, like they've always been, British and American politics have often gone hand in hand. And, when populism increased in Britain, it also did in America. Is there just a kind of intrinsic binding of our histories that might make us uncomfortable sometimes, but actually we like it? We often say the special relationship. So is that just a kind of inevitable binding of our histories?
Yeah, I mean, and also, we exist under the kind of NATO umbrella and rely on the United States to protect us in Europe from from what's going on in Russia. I mean, yeah, it is. I mean, it's an English-speaking thing as well. Like America's the cultural hegemon. It's like we consume, as Tom was saying, we grew up consuming American music, American films. You know, I'm sure I've seen more American films than I've seen like British films. It is to some extent inevitable, but again, that can mean you transpose things from the American context which don't quite apply here in terms of your analysis of problems in the UK. I mean, yeah, some things will be similar, but some things. Again, America is a different society in terms of race from the UK, and in terms of kind of how deep-rooted social class was here. I mean, the American Revolution was about throwing off that system initially, at least. So that there are going to be points of divergence, which we shouldn't just look at it through exactly the same prism.
And just one question to you, Sonia, before we open it up to the floor. I think the feminists in Britain is a really great example of how they quite successfully pushed back against various different forms of ideology, anti-democratic ideology within institutions. How have they done that? And I think in some ways it's actually much more successful than the kind of racial pushback that's come against certain American narratives. That the organising has been very active. They talk all the time. They've got various different groups. How have the feminists, gender critical feminists, done that?
The courts. Like that, the courts have been so important. So all the big wins have been as a result of the courts forcing these captured institutions to behave differently, and then sometimes not even behaving differently. So you had the Court of Appeal rule that the College of Policing had behaved unlawfully in terms of its guidance on non-crime hate incidents, for example. And like you get these court rulings, and these institutions are so captured that, I mean, sometimes not even that forces their hand. It's kind of nuts. But it would not have happened without the courts. And, Maya Forstater, she took the first really significant court case, which was, an employment discrimination case about her gender critical belief. That has literally, because it went to the Employment Appeal Tribunal, and they ruled that gender critical belief is a protected belief under the Equality Act. That has literally been the judgment that so many women are relying upon to sort of get their day in court. But it's not sustainable to do it through the courts because, in the end, the courts are the place. And I've watched a lot of these court cases. I've watched the hearings online. And it seems to be the one place where actually the kind of ridiculousness that this ideology has just captured certain societal institutions where it gets revealed in the courts because, barristers and judges don't really have any truck with people just saying, but it's hateful, you can't say that. You literally get judges saying, it's not right to say that people are bigots and transphobic when they're not. They're just taking part in a legitimate democratic debate. But it's very, very expensive, and women have crowdfunded their cases, and you can't, like when you're bullied against and discriminated, there will be a few women, very extraordinary women, who take an employment tribunal case. I wouldn't take an employment tribunal case. I know what it costs you. I know what it means for your reputation. I know what it means for how you would work in future. So the courts have been such an important part of the fight back. I mean, look at Scotland. The only way that self-ID is not law in Scotland is because of the courts. And it was literally grassroots feminist organisations taking the ONS to court to force them to collect data on sex in the census, for example. So I think, without the courts, feminists would not be turning the tide. It's been really, really key and really important.
Yeah, I just want to quickly make another point, which is I think that when we talk about American cultural imports, I think one interesting aspect is the extent to which it's disproportionately shaped by the sorts of coastal cities in America. So it's often New York or Washington, D.C. or Silicon Valley or Los Angeles or Massachusetts, rather than the sort of large swathes in the middle of America.
Just a quick question, actually. I just had another one that came to mind for you, Tomiwa. I mean, one of the things that I wonder is the reason why we imported America's culture wars is just because they have a much more developed academic scholarship around race. So even the kind of buzzword critical race theory, it was a body of scholarship that had existed since the 70s and 80s and so on. And whilst we do have some academic institutions around race in the UK, it's not as developed. And I do wonder do we need more of that here? But then the other side, I'm like, do we really want more kind of race-related, departments and so on that look into that? So I mean, I think that could have been part of the reason because it's so well developed in America.
I think that's definitely part of the reason. But I think that I would say we definitely don't need more departments in the UK simply dedicated to race, because the people that represent those departments do an extremely terrible job of what they do, and they sort of advertise precisely by the way that they behave why we don't need more departments dedicated to race. I think if what we do need, in fact, is departments dedicated to actually helping not just Black British people, but younger British people of whatever racial and ethnic background, rather than the kind of divisive ideological nonsense that we often get.
We are now going to open it up to the floor, so please put your hand up if you have any questions. Put your hand up high. Okay, we'll take like 2 or 3 at a time. So we'll go to you first.
Hi, thanks for your contributions, and it's very interesting. I was just interested though, I kind of noticed a bit of an absence maybe in the comparison between the British and American culture wars of not discussing, say, the influence of religion that's maybe been really important in the US, like the moral majority that came out with Jerry Falwell, Pat Buchanan talking about the culture wars in the Republican convention in the 90s. Is that something that's kind of factor here, or is it developing as a factor? I mean, I can think of like, say, Rees-Mogg and his views on abortion, but I wondered what your thoughts are on that. And then also, sorry, about the other thing about maybe the different interpretations around freedom in the US as well, like to the point where even socialized healthcare amongst many is seen as an infringement upon choice and freedom. Maybe what differences there are with that in the respective culture wars.
2 good questions. We'll take another one, then we'll go back to the floor.
It's mainly a question for Sonia, but obviously I think anybody can answer it. It's very interesting you talking about the judges as being the last bastion, effectively against gender theory. Is that, do you think, partly because the judges tend to be rather old? Do you not think that unfortunately that bastion may retire quite soon or leave the world in some other ways? And basically, is the whole thing then, is the battle then lost?
Good question.
Yeah, I think the religious aspect is very fascinating because among certain Tory MPs like Miriam Cates and Danny Kruger, evangelical Christianity does inform their political outlook. But I think they definitely represent a minority. And so religion simply doesn't play the same role in politics in the UK that it does in America. But in fact, one of the striking things is I would argue that religion is one similarity that Black American people share with Black British people. For many Black British people and also Black American people, of course, religion is an extremely important part of their identity. And in fact, that's partly one of the reasons why London is the most religious city in the UK, because it's also the most ethnically diverse city. So that's definitely an interesting aspect into the discussion.
Yeah, I would say the difference between one of the big differences with America
is religious hucksterism hasn't taken off here in the way that it is big business in the United States, which is, that's a big part of this whole culture war push. Also, if you look at Britain's and Americans' views on taxation and public services, Britons are Europeans in terms of how they view public services, how they view in terms of how they think public services should be funded, and Americans, you're not going to ban guns in the United States, but that's you're not going to outlaw abortion here, and it's unimaginable to see those debates being exactly the same in either country. Again, in lots of those aspects, America is a completely different, we're way more European than we are American on those issues.
And Sonia?
Yeah, so on the question about judges, it's a really interesting question. I don't think it's just because they're old. I think it's because the courts are one of the more independent aspects of society. They remain one of the more independent. Although that's not universally true, I think it has proved true to a degree on this issue. And judges are bound by the law, and they've got to go by what the law says. And the law says you can't discriminate against women because they think sex is real. So I think it's that. And the reason why I don't think it's just an age thing is because I think there's loads of old people who've been absolute moral cowards on this, who run institutions, who are like proper grown-ups, who are the people who are meant to stand up to bullies on Twitter, and actually they're like, oh, we're a bit scared of them. Maybe we will just, push that person out of our institution. So I don't think age is a protector against moral cowardice on this issue. In fact, I think there's a lot of old people who've been, or older people, I should say, who've been moral cowards. I absolutely do think there is a generational gradient. I think you see that in polling, but I think it's important not to over-exaggerate it. I mean, so I'm in my early 40s. Virtually every woman I know on the left thinks the same as I do. They're a moderately gender-critical left-wing feminists. I don't have any. I mean, I know one or two women my age who would be on the other side of the debate, but not like really, really fervently. And I know quite a few women, and sure, they're all politically engaged, but none of them believe this stuff. None of them. And I don't think it's true to say that all teenagers believe it, for example. In fact, that just isn't true. And there are some teenagers and some people at university who are really getting sick of it, actually. One thing I will say is that I think it's harder to be gender critical if you're younger, particularly if you're a teenager or in your early 20s. I think social media, actually, and the influence of social media on young people's lives in the way that it's different to somebody in my generation. It's more invasive, if anything. It makes it harder to speak out about this stuff. And there are still, women in their teens and in their early 20s who are doing it, and they're much braver than the women in my generation who are doing it. So all credit to them. So I don't think it's a universal belief system, and I think it's going to be very difficult to overturn in institutions that are doing unhealthy things, where these very unhealthy institutional cultures have set in. But I do think it will be overturned. I just don't think it will stand in the long term. I'm very optimistic about it.
We'll go for another round of questions. Put your hands up. You in the front?
Okay, I would like to pose a suggestion regarding the American right and its influence. I feel like there are Gen X and older conservative writers in the UK I can respect to some degree. I'll have my disagreements, but my favourite writer, actually, old, dead, conservative writer. But the millennials, no, I can't stand them. And I think a lot of it is that the influence from the American right, it loves personal responsibility. It loathes and hates with a vengeance any idea of social responsibility. All these American right and now British millennial right figures seem to regard any idea that you are responsible for more than just yourself and your direct family with total disgust. And I have found it impossible to have much sympathy for their waning influence on young millennials. So if anyone has any opinions on that statement.
Cool.
I mean, I agree.
We'll take a couple more from the floor, then we'll go to the panel. You over here? No, the gentleman here.
Yeah, probably talk about the role of legislation. So in the US, you've got the Supreme Court, for example, which interprets the Constitution and put a stop to discrimination when judging applicants to universities, for example.
The affirmative action.
Yeah, affirmative action, for example. Whereas here in Europe and in the UK in particular, you've got a different sort of top-down legislative means of stopping discrimination, which can be a double-edged sword sometimes. So, for example, the Equality Act both stops that kind of racial discrimination, but also at the same time, the Equality Act and arguably the public sector equality duty and things like that are the reason why you get this sort of institutional capture.
Yeah.
So given the fact that it's so important as a way of stopping this sort of discrimination, how do you kind of navigate a way of winning these battles without undermining that important stopgap?
I think those are two big questions. We'll come back out again, but I think you might have some thoughts.
I disagree with that, actually. I don't think the Equality Act leads to discrimination. I think it's culture that leads to discrimination, and people like lying about what the Equality Act says. So, people actually go out and spread misinformation, reputable charities about the Equality Act, and says that it must, if someone says they're of the opposite sex, you must treat them as though they were. Like, the Equality Act doesn't say that. I think the public sector equality duty is actually quite important. I think it has been culture, not the law, that has led institutions to do discriminatory things. I don't see I think the Equality Act is actually a landmark piece of legislation that does, very well at balancing complex conflicts of rights. I think it's really important, and certainly for feminists, gender critical feminists, it has been an absolutely key tool in fighting back.
Did you have examples that you think might illustrate that? Because I do know there are debates where people do think that the Equality Act is a problem, but it would be interesting to hear.
So no specific ones come to mind. All I know is that it's far too open to interpretation and it's far too vague, which is why these things come up in the first place. So I get these issues in the first place, and this appeals to both the Equality Act and the ECHR as well at the same time. So this kind of top-down approach to legislation, which is so vague that it ultimately becomes quite counterproductive.
But the issue is that if you're going to have any kind of legislation that makes discrimination unlawful, it's always going to be quite complex, and it always has to be high level. And case law is always going to determine, how it's interpreted by employers, etc. And I didn't really understand this as a non-lawyer until I started writing about the Equality Act. I started talking to a lot of lawyers about it. It's a relatively new piece of legislation, in the sense that it's. Yeah, exactly. And I was shocked. I was like, what, that's new? The law is just a law, and surely people should just be able to read the law and understand what it says. No, of course not. And so I think if you want to make discrimination unlawful, I really think the Equality Act, having spent a lot of time writing about it, speaking to experts about it, is a good way of doing it. But the questions about obviously it's open to misinterpretation, and people have really spread misinformation about what it says to try and get people to do unlawful things. But that is a problem. I still think that's a cultural problem, because you can't ever get down on paper exactly what discrimination in every circumstance looks like. The courts it's always going to be open to interpretation by the court. So, I haven't heard, I don't think that's a problem, but I'd be really interested in talking to you more about it to understand where the concerns come from, because it's not a sort of line of argument that I've heard.
No, fair enough. James, I don't know if you had some points on the gentleman's argument about the influence on of the American discourse on the kind of younger right wing.
I would look at people like Rand and the guy who came up with the prisoner's dilemma for sort of what I think has happened, but that's kind of what I was getting at.
Yeah,
I think you can see the American influence on kind of the young right here, trying to import this kind of libertarian framework, but it's just kind of falling flat. It's not really. I see what they're trying to do, and there is some cut through, but it isn't really. It's kind of falling flat. I think again with the kind of cancel culture stuff, I think there are different issues in the UK and the US. One of the reasons cancel culture is a bigger thing in the US, I think, is because it's very easy to get someone fired. It's very easy. There's employment protections are terrible, are horrendous in the US. But also here, we don't have a First Amendment, so there are issues here around. There has been an encroachment on free speech. The category of hate speech has kind of expanded, you actually do have people who have the police turn up at their house because they've told a joke on Twitter, which is abhorrent.
I think I tweeted at you something which happened.
The police came to your house after.
I just got an angry.
I reported you.
Well, I said I should have sent it to the news, made a big stink about it.
But yeah, I would argue that we should, move towards something more like a First Amendment in the UK. While I would urge the Americans to actually make it harder to fire people, so you can't just get people fired for things they say on Twitter.
But it's one of the reasons why the younger British right seems less interested in, you said, social responsibility, right? It's one of the reasons, because they are less religious than older generations of British. Because you mentioned Ayn Rand, and she, if correct me if I'm wrong, but she was an atheist, wasn't she? So there's that sort of individualist, sort of social Darwinist aspect.
If it's good for me, it's right.
So I just had a quick question actually on the point that you made, James. Because you were kind of critiquing some aspects of maybe the younger right of embracing American ways of they're performative and the way they approach media, for example. But isn't that just something that everybody does? You might look at other countries and a particular movement that's successful in the ideas that you advocate for and seek to replicate that particular way of being because you think it's successful. I mean, do you think there's something different about what the British kind of populist right are doing that makes it a bit more sinister?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's many things sinister about it, but no, it isn't unique. I mean, you have people on the left, you have idiots on the left who try to import the kind of Leninist model to the UK. I mean, that's stupid. And I'm not trying to make some moral equivalence, but yeah, you do have people on the right who believe that the COVID vaccine is kind of killing people, who are spreading this stuff, lying about these things, who do think that the problem is the state, the welfare state's got too big, who are pushing these ideas. And fine if you think that, but that's not where the people are. If you look at opinion polls, that's not what people think here. So I mean, welcome to believe that and make that case, but it's not gonna. You're not going to be very popular making that here.
Yeah, I think that's.
Sorry about that.
No, I think that's fair enough. Back to the floor. Okay, you had your hand up before, so.
Yeah, it was just a quick question. Do you think that the American sort of like culture wars have made it okay to just lie blatantly? It didn't seem that way before in the UK, but now it seems it's okay to just tell lies on television and radio.
So that's an interesting. And the guy just in front.
Yeah. I was going to ask about. You mentioned 4% of the UK population were black.
It's black.
It's black now.
It's black now. Yeah. Taking it back to the American import. I think we have about twice as many people that are Asian in the UK.
That's true.
Anecdotally, I don't see twice as many Asian people involved in that aspect of the culture. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts on what that means. Does it tell us it's an import, BLM, etc., or something else?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. So we had a question about lies and how whether the American culture wars has brought in this kind of lying culture, and a question about the way that the culture wars are spread in so many issues, and then the gentleman there about the difference in population. Who wants to pick up first?
Yeah, I just wanted to make a point about. I do think
Politics has become more dishonest, but then, like instinctively, I think why is that? There is, like, I've thought about this. Why is it? It does feel like people are more shamelessly lying, and this is just like off the top of my head theory. I mean, I feel like social media, if you look at incentives on social media, for something to gain like clout, something to gain traction, it doesn't have to be necessarily truthful. You can have millions of people agreeing with you, saying you're awesome, and what you're saying is kind of spot on, and it doesn't have to have like any element of truth to it. And I think it's weird to think that we can kind of compartmentalize that and it won't spread. It won't kind of infect the rest of society. I think that's maybe part of it. And you could also obviously look at the kind of the way in which social media exposes us to kind of the most kind of potent form of the people from the other side. So the picture of the person who disagrees with us is this kind of tyrannical kind of, because you're thinking of the worst possible tweets of the person on the other side. So you kind of give them less kind of leeway, and you're willing to lie because it's for the greater good. It's for the kind of bigger, wider kind of struggle, and because otherwise those people are going to take over. I think.
I agree with James on that. I blame social media for a lot in terms of, its polarising effects. I do think, though, that the hope is actually when you look at public attitudes, as you said, James, the UK is clearly much less socially polarised than the US on kind of a number of issues. But I do think that it does, and this is a thing, this is why I think you can never say it's just social media, it's just what happens online. What happens on social media, it changes our political discourse and the nature of our political discourse, and it absolutely has. Like, you can see that. And it's, it's interesting because I've made programmes on the idea of deliberative democracy and citizens' juries. And it's really interesting when you look at that stuff in action, like, there was a citizens' jury run by academics on Brexit. I think the case of Northern Ireland on abortion, this is how, eventually abortion got, not in Northern Ireland, in the Republic of Ireland, please don't quote me on that. That's how it eventually abortion got legalised in the Republic of Ireland. There was a citizens' assembly on it. And when you get people together to have conversations that are well informed, that are informed by evidence and expert opinion, I've got masses of faith. Like, I think most people will sit down, they'll talk to each other, and they'll hash something out. And that citizens' jury came up with something really, sensible on Brexit. It was like, okay, well, we should leave because people voted to leave, but we should be a member of the single market, essentially. And, on abortion in Ireland, politicians were absolutely shocked when a citizens' assembly in the society where they never thought people would come together on it. There was a consensus position reached by this citizens' assembly, even including very religious Catholics, that abortion needed to be liberalised. And for me, I guess the problem is that social media takes us exactly in the opposite direction of some of those informed conversations you have with people with different, people come to citizens' assemblies with completely different values, caring about different things, and they can still find elements of consensus. And my worry about politics at the moment, the culture of politics that is fueled by social media, is it just incentivizes us to kind of like never find those points of commonality. And you have to know how to talk to each other. So it's, when you look at research on how to change people's minds, you have to accept that you come from different starting points and you care about different things, but you can find solidarity in something. That is, I'm sorry, but that is old-fashioned left-wing politics. And the new form of left identitarian politics that we see in the US and in some areas in the UK, it's literally like, Stonewall's perspective on gender was, we are going to bully people into this. I'm sorry, it doesn't work. Stonewall have done trans people so much damage in the UK because there is a backlash now. And it's not a backlash that I like. And it's because Stonewall tried to bully people, not into supporting robust protections against discrimination of trans people. They tried to bully people. They tried to frighten them into believing something they didn't believe. And that is considered that for a time. And I think some people still think that is left-wing politics. That is not left-wing politics. That is bullying. Left-wing politics is building solidarity between different people who come from different traditions, who might care about things for different reasons, but saying we can find common cause.
And Tomiwa, did you want to pick up on the point about?
Yeah, it's a very relevant point because in the UK, the Asian population of the UK is twice as large as the black population. The Asian population is, I believe, 9%, whereas in America it's the other way around. So the black American population is twice as large as the Asian population. And I think one of the interesting aspects of the debate around race is the extent to which different ethnic minority groups have different outcomes in terms of education, employment, and so forth. So the groups that do best in the British education system are the British Indian pupils and British Chinese pupils. And that's also the case in America as well. And so I think when we talk about race, we need to be more specific in our focus rather than just making generalizations about BAME people or POC. There's a lot of acronyms in this debate. So we need to be more specific in our focus in that regard.
Definitely. And I actually think that the assumption that everybody who's Asian or everybody who's black will take a particular political view, and if you don't, there's something a bit wrong with you. And that comes from white people as well as brown and black people. And unfortunately, it is a facet of politics in the UK. That is racism to me. Somebody who assumes that because I'm Asian, I'm going to take a particular view on a political issue. I get that sometimes, and it's racism, and it comes from people on the left too.
So we're just going to have 2 more rounds of questioning. So if you have a question, please ask it in the next 2 rounds. Okay, so the lady at the...
You want to touch a little bit on the outsized impact of, I think you call it kind of overeducated elites who are then overrepresented in media, journalism, the arts, and that the impact that's had on our culture. Kind of putting that back to where that originates, maybe in university. I wonder if you could tell us, speak maybe a little bit to the culture in universities. I think a lot of thinkers on the subject have talked about, the notion that a lot of these problems start in the culture of universities, both in the US and in the UK. Do you think that issue is being recognised in universities, and is the trajectory positive or negative?
Good question. We'll take...
I know Sonia said that she didn't think there was so much of a sort of generational aspect to the culture wars.
I think there is, but I think we shouldn't over-exaggerate it.
Yeah. I think there probably is a little bit. And I was wondering whether you think that to an extent that's because, I mean, for my generation especially, there's a lot of discourse about how we're sort of far less well off than we might have been however many years ago. It's more difficult to find houses, that kind of thing. I was wondering whether you think this is like a search for agency or a sort of generational war.
Right, good question. Another one more. I saw a couple of hands up. You at the back there, yeah?
Thanks so much. I was just wondering, one thing that strikes me about American politics is how cruel and juvenile a lot of people are, even more so than in the UK. On the left, it tends to be, I guess, social media and cancellations, but even more worryingly, it's on the right in the mainstream of the Republican Party on the stage at CPAC and in the Republican primaries. I was wondering if any of the panelists have witnessed, and they probably have, people who've gone off the deep end in this way from whatever side of the political spectrum. What do they put that down to?
Interesting. Okay. Who wants to pick up? As I think maybe a you question, James, about is this a call for agency amongst young people as the kind of material conditions have not been in their favour, and so they're grappling for something?
Yeah. No, I think that's fair. I mean, I think the institutions through which people in the past, maybe on a social democratic left, or the institutions through which you kind of try to assert some autonomy, and not the same as they were before. So there is a kind of faith, like almost a nihilistic. I feel like a lot of this stuff is quite, like online especially, is quite nihilistic on the left at the moment. So it's like you've seen that recently with I've seen people on the left, the American left in particular, who are like cheering on the Houthi bombardment of like ships, like piracy, and it's just, I mean, do they?
The British left as well.
Yeah, I mean, and it's like, do they really think that? Like, I don't think so. I think it's just kind of this kind of performative nihilism, this kind of fuck you to the world. It doesn't really, and it's extremely juvenile. It's like the point there about politics becoming this extremely juvenile thing, and also I think, like I've been writing a book on the manosphere, so like Andrew Tate and people like this, and among his like base following, there's so much of it's kind of conspiratorial, and then it feeds into this MAGA movement as well. And on the one hand, you could, so I met people who voted for example, Bernie Sanders, who are now kind of MAGA people, and obviously that's like not everyone's like that, but you have these people who on the one hand are kind of disenfranchised, but then on the other hand, like don't know how to explain like what's going on, like so they just kind of get told it's these nefarious elites, and it becomes this sort of weird amorphous thing of people pulling the strings behind the scenes. and it doesn't feel like the old left, for all its faults, there was kind of an explanatory power to that. That like this is why capitalism is like this. This is what you should do. You should join a union. You should kind of go give these leaflets out. You should vote for this party. And like, I'm not saying that's perfect or anything, but there's this whole space now where you have these internet kind of hucksters who sell people this kind of populist, like anti-elitist idea. But there is this very kind of dangerous edge to it where it's where it becomes very conspiratorial. So it's these people behind the scenes, and you see that now. Now it is moving to flat out anti-Semitism. You have the richest man in the world, like subtly pointing the finger. It's the Jews doing it, which is the way conspiracy theories always lead.
And it's not a right or left wing thing. It's often shaped, I think, by some of these personalities.
I think it's a personality thing. Yeah.
Some people with certain personalities that are quite sensitive and quite paranoid by nature are more attracted to like conspiratorial thinking, and also they tend to be quite narcissistic as well in terms of their personality profiles. What one person I'm thinking is somebody that I know that James knows and some other people in this audience knows, Majid Nawaz, who like about 10 years ago was running as a candidate for the Liberal Democrats, but now he's conspiracy theorist on Twitter, and I think thinking back, I think even back then when he wasn't explicitly conspiratorial in his politics, there were certain aspects of his personality which might have predisposed him to embracing the kind of politics he has now. So like with certain issues, it's very difficult to say whether somebody is far right or far left, like the war in Ukraine, for example, or certain other geopolitical issues. It's very difficult to make those kinds of distinctions.
Yeah. So I think you've hit the nail on the head there. I've written about this before as well. My little theory is that social media has differential effects on different people, and it's worse for people with some personality types. And I really think that so I think social media probably has an impact on us all. And I find myself having to fight the tendency to move to more hardline positions when I'm engaged in debate on social media, because it is just human psychology. It ends up, because it's, as James says, you end up focusing on the people who are really nasty to you online from the other side, and it's a very human instinct to become more hardline. And you really have to check yourself, and it's very difficult, so there's that. But I think it's particularly bad for some personality types, for us as a society. So I think it happens to us at an individual level, but my theory is that also at an aggregate society level, in the same ways that sort of cream rises to the top, it incentivizes people with different personality types to get to the more powerful positions when it comes to social change and social campaigning. And basically it pulls out narcissism in us as individuals, but it also makes the most narcissistic individuals rise to the top. And that is very, very unhealthy for us as a society, because we do not want extreme narcissists running institutions or being the most powerful people in terms of setting the terms of public debate. In fact, we want people who are not that. And I think we are moving in exactly the wrong direction on that. That's my little theory.
Anyone want to pick up, maybe you, Tomiwa, on the point that was about the role of the universities? Should we be optimistic or pessimistic about?
So when I was at university, which was less than 10 years ago.
Oh, you've revealed your age now.
I was actually surprised, because before I actually attended university, I was one of those weird teenagers that were interested in free speech and race and cultural issues. I was one of those teenagers. So I expected going to university to be this kind of cauldron of competing ideas. But the striking thing is that most university students simply don't give a shit. and exactly, they're more interested in getting drunk and sleeping with anyone they wanted to sleep with than sort of debating the philosophical roots of liberalism or
Showing how
capitalism.
popular you are.
Well, the thing is, when I was at university, I was not exactly. I was not one of the people that sort of joined the university debating societies or joined like the university newspaper journals or whatever, because I just found, because those people in fact were the least cool people at university campuses. So I think it is definitely a small minority of university students which influence the culture wars, but the overwhelming majority of university students are more interested in academic and social aspects of their degree rather than politics.
So we're going to go for the final round of questioning. So please put your hand up if you have a question, even if it's a statement. We'll just take all of them, and the panel may not be able to respond, but we'll just hear your thoughts. Gentleman over there, you haven't had a chance to speak. You.
Me.
Yeah.
James is probably best placed to answer this, but from what I say, I can give it a stab.
Thanks.
One point that's being made with like the culture wars is that not only is it, someone's touched on it, might be a bit of an age intergenerational conflict, but in America it's often there's an intersex conflict in that when we look at the polling, young men in America, young women overwhelmingly vote Democrat, and then young men much more likely to vote Republican. It's probably related to the fact that certain some of the like really popular right commentators like Tucker Carlson, he's been willing to interview Tate like in a cozy manner, and so I think there's also more of like an association with the culture wars in America with the kind of conflict of masculinity, and there's on social media some of the figures are saying that's going to be a problem for almost like relationships in America, because a lot of young men and women can't find dates because politics matters a lot more apparently in compatibility. I was wondering if James or anyone else, you think that perception is correct, and if so, is it likely for the UK, or is it again not so polarized?
Yeah, that is I've seen some polling that like women are more likely to not date someone because of their politics and yeah. We'll come we'll come back to that. A few other hands up. You haven't spoken.
Do you think some of the divisions in society regarding these issues will get better or worse with the Labour government?
Interesting. Some people who haven't spoken. Any other people? Oh, you over there?
I was going to stand up, sorry.
Okay.
I was going to say that it's interesting because if you take a look around the room at the moment, we've got what, 80%, 90% men? I'd argue that Equiano Project is kind of leans kind of towards the right.
I wouldn't say so.
Oh,
No.
Okay, well, anyway, it's interesting that there are more men here than women. Just your point about whether or not that culture of import has come to the UK already. It seems like it might be here already in terms of those views, but yeah.
Fair enough.
But,
Someone else, last person who hasn't spoken. You over there at the back. Yeah.
Hey, good evening. So we mentioned that social media can be polarizing. I think as of recently we've seen the rise of intentionalized fact checking services like community notes on Twitter. So I was curious towards, I suppose, the role that community notes, speech like community notes, and platforms like Twitter will have in creating nuance and reducing the amount of like, I suppose, authoritarianism that can exist on both sides of the political spectrum. Yeah.
Okay. And there's another guy that hasn't spoken. We'll just hear from him quickly. Sorry if you forget all the questions.
Slightly linked point. How much of the culture war in general, everyone keeps mentioning social media, how much of it is to do with an overflow of information and a way of managing too much information online?
Okay. So we have a question about overflow of information, the kind of relationship between the crisis of masculinity. I think that, and there was some question that was somewhat related to that.
Yeah, and also the Labour Party.
The Labour Party, that's right. Yeah.
Just the question about this gender divide between like right and left populism in some ways, right and left politics. I mean, I think part of it is you have this pertinent question for lots of men at the moment. It's around kind of social status, where, I mean, with my book Hired, one thing I wasn't really thinking about at all when I went out to do it was I went to lots of these communities where a lot of the men felt they didn't have social status anymore. And on the one hand, on the one hand, that was because there was now equality, so they had to adjust to that. But you know, and someone like Susan Faludi wrote a very good book called Backlash about that aspect of it some years ago. But then there was also a kind of sense that, you know, what is, if you're not kind of for these men anyway, if you're not a kind of manual worker, what is my place in the world? And I think that is kind of an ongoing question. You know, what is my kind of, where do I draw status from in the world? And that's also where you see some of these kind of influencers gaining ground at the moment, selling the idea that to be a man is to present this kind of image to the world, whether it's, you know, the Andrew Tate image, you know, you have a Bugatti, you have to get rich, you have to relate to women in this particular way. I think that's kind of, I think Richard Reeves has written a very good book about called Boys and Men about this subject, and it is kind of an ongoing subject, and it's very easy, I think, for politicians to kind of again, like in the American context, right-wing politicians to tell these men that the problem is the emancipation of women, the problem is you know, women's economic progress. That's the problem, and it's not these kind of other things. I think that's a very live conversation. I think those issues are, you know, feeding into politics a lot at the moment and feeding into the culture war. Yeah, I think that's part of this. Yeah, I mean, like adjusting to deindustrialization still is kind of the blowback from deindustrialization, which is it didn't just like happen in the 1980s and 90s and then stop. It's kind of an ongoing thing, and you know, there's that residual memory within families of the kind of male breadwinner occupying this very traditional role, and I think even generations down, even though, like, to me, when I hear that, I think, oh, that's just like ridiculous. Like, I don't care about that. But then you do kind of that there is still that kind of cultural memory in society, so you do have to constantly be kind of making readjustments to the fact that you have to relate to women in a different way to members of your actual family did, or the culture did even like 10, 20 years ago.
But one of the ways that that cultural memory manifests itself is in the way that these stereotypes get imposed on young boys and young girls. And like, this is the thing, as a feminist, like, I believe that these toxic, you know, masculine stereotypes, they are just as damaging to boys and young men as they are to girls and young women. And like, I think one of the things that because I don't believe, we certainly haven't got sex equality in my view, in the sense that, you know, women still suffer, like most violence in society is perpetrated by a small number of men, not by most men, but a small number of men. We haven't really figured out what to do about that, and women are still not economically empowered in the same way that men are, and that is because we're the people who take time out of work to have children on average, and then we never get careers back on track in the same way. Now, you can debate how much that is choice and how much of that is constrained choice imposed by society. I think a lot of it is constrained, but I think one of the issues is that we haven't really had a conversation about what equality actually means and what equality by the sexes mean, what it means for men, what it means for women. So, for example, I strongly believe that if you're a parent, we should have a cultural norm that you don't work full time, because, you know, all parents should be working like 3 to 4 days a week and spending time with their children. But we don't have a society that makes that possible for men culture. Like, it's paternity leave. Yeah, exactly. Whereas, for example, in Iceland, I mean, it's not a nirvana, but in Iceland, but because basically one of the issues with shared paternity leave is you don't get to pay the same amount that women do, and also there is in many industries there is still a shame in asking for it, and you won't get it. In Iceland, they made it use it or lose it. So you either use it and you get it from your employer, or you lose it. The other parent doesn't get to take it, the mum doesn't get to take it, and hey presto, like 90-something% of dads take their paternity leave because it was made culturally okay for them to do so. And I think we really have to think about that kind of stuff. It's not like all a battle between the sexes, because actually, when you look at the polling, men of a younger generation, they do want to do more, like they do want to spend more time with their kids and stuff, but there's a lot in society that culturally doesn't make that possible.
But that's how it's been presented, though.
Is it? Well, we can continue that discussion afterwards.
US feminism. I think one of the reasons why the US is so nuts on gender is because their feminism is actually really shallow.
I think just on the point, I think someone should pick up on the point about the Labour government. Tomiwa.
That's a very interesting question, because as Sonia can probably explain more eloquently than I can, one of the striking things about the gender ideology debate is that the people that have been most successful in resisting it are not conservative politicians or activists. The people that have been most successful in resisting it are left-wing feminists. And I think one of the interesting dynamics of the culture wars is the extent to which it's basically an intra-left conflict. Certain aspects of the progressive left demonizing other aspects of the left, and I think that is one of the most important aspects and elements of it. With regards to the Labour Party, they've certainly changed their position.
They've been on a journey.
So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out when they come into government.
And I think we have come to an end. They have a massive round of applause for our fantastic panel.